Morning, conference. Just before we start, just want to dispel one of the myths, really. When we talked about the title of the presentation, first question was asked, one, good, the bad and the ugly, which one are you? I'll leave you to make your own mind up there. But I don't know whether anyone has ever owned a watch by the Swiss watchmaker Patek Philippe, but their advertising slogan has long been, you never actually own a Patek Philippe, you merely look after it for the next generation. Command Resilience feels a bit like that. It's a business area that's been handed on from generation to generation. I took over from Alan Green, multi-talented Alan Green, as anybody who was in the bar last night would testify. Well, the campaigns for Command Resilience over the years have centred on a number of things. We've had campaigns to improve the resilience of members through increasing our numbers. We've had Revitalise and Be a Better Superintendent toolkits and the online health management system. And we've also had some campaigns to look at working time regulations. This year, the business area has completed, or is completing two major pieces of work. There's the sixth person resilience survey of members, which really looks at how members as individuals are affected by what's going on in forces. We had over 1,000 responses to that survey, which was almost 82% of our members. And I think that means that those results should not and cannot be ignored by forces. And we also, a separate piece of work we're doing is a working time regulations survey of forces. The European working time regulations places a legal duty on chief officers to have a system in place to record the hours that are worked of all members and also to monitor compliance. Failure to do that is a criminal offence. And we want to know what forces have in place or not to discharge that legal duty, to record and monitor the hours of their workforce, but more importantly, to do something about it. But today's presentation really focuses on the Personal Resilience Survey. Emma Donaldson-Feilder, who's an occupational psychologist from an organisation called Affinity Health at Work. Emma will present the survey, the outline, key findings from the survey, and some further work she's undertaken on our behalf to analyse the results in a bit more detail and identify the good, the bad and the ugly. And also Andy Rhodes from Lancashire Constabulary. One of the things that struck us when we looked at the survey was we're all operating in the same environment. We're all dealing with reductions in numbers. We're about 25% less superintendents now than there were a few years back. We're all having to face budget cuts, austerity, and all that goes with that. So the question really for us was, if we all operate in that same context, why do some forces and the superintendents appear to cope with this better than others? And Andy will hopefully begin to shed some light on that when he talks about what they're doing in Lancashire to improve well-being. But before we begin, James Henderson, the Commercial Director from Police Mutual, who sponsored this year's survey, is going to tell us a bit about Police Mutual Foundation and why they thought it was important to sponsor the survey.
Morning, everyone. You'll be forgiven for thinking, what's this got to do with PMAS? So I'm just going to take you through a couple of slides just to give you some context. I also think we can do some stuff to help you and the people who work for you too, and I want to share a bit about that. Really quick background, Foundation was created in 2011. We get loads of support from police service and we wanted to give some of that back. Foundation is a vehicle in which we fund up to £1 million a year into the Foundation, and we've established a broad church of people, including Irene from the Supers, to help us spend that money and make sure it's sent to places where it can help. And just to give you kind of a sense of what's available, there's lots of stuff, and I could talk to you about it all day. Clearly, I can't. So there's a couple of things I just want to pull out for you. We can provide health screening. We provide a wellbeing zone and a respite service. And there's some kind of key facts and figures. You'll have noticed that the wellbeing, the health bus is out the front. So. I think from our perspective, there's a load of solutions in there. If you need to put an arm around your people and you're a bit short of resource and time to do that, then we might be able to help. So please come and talk to us while we're here about some of the things which are available to you. We've also fund specific initiatives, and there's a range here, and I just want to pull out. So obviously the Resilience Survey, we're delighted to provide funding to enable that to go ahead. There's some specific things we've done with police treatment centres, helping to support roles and renovation. And we've also helped to contribute towards the Lancashire Wellbeing Programme, which you'll hear about in a minute. So if you've got a great idea, which is wellbeing related, and you need help to resource that, then again, please come and talk to us. We might be able to help you. So absolutely delighted to help sponsor the Resilience, and looking forward to hearing the results. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, James. Well, the actual survey that was carried out was carried out, as Steve said, by Emma Donaldson-Feilder, who's an occupational psychologist and who works for Affinity Health at Work. So without further ado, let's welcome her and find out what she discovered. Thank you.
Hello everybody, it's great to see you all here today, and it brings back memories. The first time I came to a Police Superintendents Association conference was back in 2007, and I can't quite believe that I've been working with the association for 7 years, but it's been great and really interesting work to be doing. In 2008 I spoke to a conference about the Be a Better Superintendent toolkit around wellbeing that we helped to develop. So it's nice to be back here now looking at how the survey is contributing to the resilience work. And it's, as an occupational psychologist, my specialism is around health, well-being, and particularly, of course, looking at some of the factors that influence that, including leadership and people management, which, of course, all superintendents and chief superintendents have a huge role in, and we may perhaps touch on that a bit in the discussion. So my role, as Steve said today, is just to give a brief overview of some of the findings and the highlights, if you like, or the lowlights from the Resilience Survey, and to talk about the extra analyses that we've been doing and how we hope that that will allow forces and branches to take steps forward in terms of addressing some of the issues highlighted by the survey. So by way of background, the Resilience Survey has now been running in one form or another since 2000. So that means it's been run 6 times. So we've got a great bank of data and tracking over time. As Affinity Health at Work, we've been running it since 2009. So we've run it 3 times now. And we did quite a bit of work in 2007, 2008, looking at the issues that are important for resilience in the superintending ranks, and adding some additional questions and reformulating the questionnaire so that it has greater utility, hopefully, in terms of finding answers to some of the problems that it highlights. So in terms of some of the results coming through, as Steve said, one of the great things is that the response rate has been fantastic. So we have really high proportion. We have 81%, nearly 82%, as Steve said, of people responding to it, which means that we can trust this data. It's not just a few people off, at a particular end of the scale. This is pretty representative of the membership as a whole. What's also very encouraging is that we had all branches have enough people complete the survey to get a branch report, and I'll talk a little bit more about branch reports towards the end, particularly the new branch ranking report that we've produced. So that's part of the really good news. In terms of the results, overall, actually, the trouble is there's not very much shift. So we're not really seeing very many improvements. In fact, in some places, we're seeing a little bit of a deterioration, not a major one. So this suggests that although we've been gathering this data for all this time, actually it doesn't seem to be having an impact. Or if it is having an impact, that's being counterbalanced by other countervailing forces. And there are some particular areas of concern, each of which I will talk about in a little bit more depth. Long hours, you won't be surprised to hear, I'm sure, but the associated risk around presenteeism is key around that. High demands, again, no big surprises there, but also low resources associated with that and the intrusion that that's making into non-work time. And then finally, some issues around ACPO and senior management and the way people are being managed, or the way that the respondents perceive that management. So in terms of the overall results, some nice good news, which I think is very telling, and it actually completely reinforces some of the things that I've discovered in terms of working with police superintendents. High level of commitment, high level of enthusiasm, and a sense that being in the police, being a police superintendent, is a vocation. It's something that you're really motivated to do and you get a buzz from. There is an enthusiasm there as well as a commitment. However, and this is one of these delicate balances, I think enthusiasm, commitment, engagement is great, and it is associated with higher well-being. If we are enjoying what we're doing, if we're committed to what we're doing, if we're feeling challenged and stretched by what we're doing, that's very good news for our well-being. But if we tip over into over-engagement and being too committed and putting in too much time and working too hard and taking on too many demands, there is a risk. And that's what the survey is also suggesting. So there are quite high levels, compared with norms, quite high levels of anxiety symptoms and depression symptoms, suggesting that overall psychological well-being may be suffering for a range of reasons, and we can touch on some of those. And the other piece of bad news is that this is slightly worse than it was last time. There is a sort of general deterioration that seems to be happening in terms of psychological well-being. So that's something that we need to stop and find ways to reverse. So in terms of those particular areas of concern that I highlighted, starting off with talking about the long working hours and the risk of presenteeism. The figures suggest very, very high proportions of people are saying that they work over the Working Time Directive. So the Working Time Directive stipulates a 48-hour working week maximum. And 77% of respondents to this survey were saying that they were working over 50 hours. And some, around 2%, were saying regularly working over 70 hours a week. Now that must carry with it a risk. It must carry with it all sorts of risks, burnout being one of them. And linked to what Steve was saying about the project that the Police Superintendents Association has been doing around actually recording working hours, one of the real concerns, I think, is that people aren't logging. Over half, 57% of respondents said they were not logging their hours accurately. And that is a concern, because it does mean that there isn't this proper monitoring going on. Now, I know that that's partly associated with poor systems. It's also associated with difficulties of logging working time that's out of working hours, so working at home and things like that. But there is also, I think, a motivational piece here, because the biggest reason given was that there was a sense that there was no point, and also that it was not a priority. So I think there's something to be addressed there about not just bringing down the working hours, but also making sure that the monitoring is working effectively. And associated with this picture of long working hours is also a picture of a long hours culture in general. So a sense that everyone tends to work long working hours. And there's a perception that that's the way you show that you're performing. And also that the people in senior positions, and of course that includes you, are working long hours. And so setting a kind of culture by role modeling that long working hours approach. So this is a picture overall of people working long hours in a prevailing long hours culture. On the sort of absence and leave and rest day side of things, there's also what initially looks like a good piece of news, which is 88% of those responding said they took no sick leave at all. So that means a very small proportion of you and the membership is taking sickness absence. But, and here's the but, if there actually seems to be quite a high proportion of people taking leave or rest days in order to avoid being seen to take sickness absence. And I know there are incentives to do that. So in some cases, it may make sense to take the odd day of leave in order to have a clean sickness absence record. But if that becomes a pattern, if people feel that they can't take sick leave, if they feel that they have to take leave or rest days in order to cover for when they're not feeling well, actually that's a very negative pattern to be getting into. And associated with that is a risk of presenteeism, a sense that you can't be seen to be absent, and that you do come in, either you take leave or a rest day, or you come in when you're sick. And that is termed presenteeism. And it means that all sorts of things. If you're infectious, it means that you're potentially passing on the bugs. If you are poorly and you need recovery, you're not getting that recovery, and it means that you're likely to be performing more poorly on those days. Decision-making, for example, is likely to suffer. And I think another piece of this picture is that when we analysed the data and looked at the impact of working longer hours, we found that those who were working longer hours also had higher levels of anxiety and of depression. So there's a picture here of people at work, but actually that leading and at work for too long, and that leading to poor psychological well-being, and not taking the time off to recover. So I think that there's a potential vicious cycle that starts to set up here, because you're coming in, you're not 100% well, therefore you're not performing very well, therefore you have to work longer hours to achieve what you're setting out to achieve, and that can feed on itself. There's also a picture of high demands, and I think this, the figures speak for themselves. Vast majorities of respondents saying they're experiencing very high levels of demand and specific types of demand, difficult HR issues, meetings, deadlines, large spans of control, and those sorts of things. And there's a picture of demands increasing. So nearly 90% of respondents said that the demands on them had increased over the last year. So that's an escalating problem going on here. In fact, what's interesting is that high demands on their own are not a problem for well-being if, and here's the if we have high demands, but we also have high levels of control and autonomy, and we have high levels of resource and support. And what this picture is suggesting is that there isn't that high level of resource and support in place in terms of feedback, in terms of training, in terms of having sufficient resources and staff to do the job. So that leads to, if you've got high demands on the one hand, but you've got high resources on the other hand, that can be imbalanced and can actually be challenging and stimulating. If you've got high demands on the one hand and you haven't got the resources to balance that out, then that can be a risk to psychological well-being. The other side of this, of course, and this draws on both, if you're working long hours and you've got high demands, there is a high risk that that's going to then intrude into your non-working time. So there's a specific intrusion type issues around phone calls at all times of day and night, and difficulty balancing the work and the non-work issues, having to perform on-call duties on rest days, taking work home. All of that is getting high levels of response. And at the same time, there's also a picture of respondents not taking their leave, not taking their rest days, and even losing rest days and leave that they're not taking. So that means there's a knock-on effect, that there isn't the leave and rest days to be taken. They're just lost. They're not postponed, if you like. But I would counsel against postponing them, even if you could carry them forward, because we do need recovery time. We do need a chance for our bodies and our minds to rest and recuperate in order to be able to perform at our best. And finally, in terms of areas of concern, there are some concerning figures about senior management. Senior management's approach to managing performance being harsh and unhelpful, 41% saying that, and people even saying that there is bullying behaviour going on. So 28% talking about bullying behaviour from ACPO, 9% talking about bullying behaviour from their direct line manager. And of course, as chief superintendents in particular, you may be managing some of the people who are responding to this survey. So it is about thinking about how your management behaviour is being interpreted and how you are coming across. And of course, if you're working long hours, you're under high demands yourself, you're feeling pretty stressed, your psychological well-being isn't good, it's really hard to manage people well. So there is likely to be an association around that as well. So it's about thinking about how can you look after yourself in order that you can look after the people that you manage. There's also seems to be a prevailing culture about a sort of slightly macho culture, isn't it? Mustn't be seen as fallible, mustn't seek support, mustn't admit that we can't cope. And that can be quite damaging because people aren't then getting the support that they need when they need it. And people feeling that they have to work hard because they don't want to be seen as weak. Same kind of thing, isn't it? And also a sense of in-crowds and cliques, which again means that people aren't feeling supported, part of a community, and so on. So those are the areas of concern. So what? So what if we know all of that? What good does it do knowing that there are all these concerns and problems? There's only any value to this if the information that we're presenting here is used to make a difference, is used to actually make some changes. And I think these changes need to happen at all levels. So they need to happen at individual level. And I think this is a very hard one for the association to crack. It is down to individual responsibility and looking at how, as individuals, do you actually reduce working hours and improve work-life balance and actually channel that energy so that it is used most effectively, so that the performance at work is efficient and effective, so that you can get time off, you can get the recovery time, you can take your leave and rest days, you can look after your health. And there's an interesting statistic in terms of when we did a closer analysis of the data that suggests those people who said they were looking after their health did actually have better health and well-being. So there is, if you start to make that commitment, it does make a difference, and you actually do see improved health and well-being. At a national level, and this is what Steve and Irene and people are taking forward, is that there's some lobbying to be done across the police force, looking at how things can be changed at a national level. But perhaps most interestingly for this year's survey, we're looking more closely at what branches can do, looking at where things are working well, and Andy's going to talk a lot more about that, and how can that then be channeled into improvements in other forces. So the reporting that we've done this year, the national report, which is key in terms of providing an average across the whole membership, it's looking at trends, it's looking at the direction of travel, it's looking at what's going on for the membership as a whole. However, that masks some highs and some lows, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the key thing then was to start looking at what's happening within branches, within specific forces. So each branch has received a branch report, which provides the branch's data in comparison with national averages, and we're now able to do some comparisons over time as well at that branch level. But the innovation for this year is that we've started to look at rankings so that we can start to look at that best-in-class issue. So we've been ranking the forces on 30 different indicators and looking at the top 5 achievers in each of the factors. So hopefully we're beginning to shed some light here on the good, the bad, and the ugly, and what can be done to make a difference. So just talking a little bit more about that new branch ranking report before Andy comes in to talk about what branches and forces can do. The purpose for conducting this extra analysis was first of all to identify for each force how they compared, where they fell in the ranking. And as I say, we chose 30 indicators. So there was anxiety and depression, and then some other specific questions. And the idea is that that enables each branch to identify specific areas that their force might wish to target. So specific areas where perhaps they are not doing so well. But also looking at the things that are working well. I'm very keen on a strengths-based approach and seeing what's working well and how can we best use that. And then also enabling branches to identify other forces that are doing well and look at the specifics of what's happening in those forces and how those might be replicated. So if you are within a branch, you will have received a ranking that looked a bit like this. So you can see for each of the indicators, so that's anxiety, depression, and then a series of the questions, you get a ranking. So this is from 1 to 45. We ranked all the forces, number 1 being the best, number 45 the lowest score on that particular indicator. We then did an average across all of those indicators. So you'll see the average ranking, and then we ranked an overall ranking, so where did people come in terms of those average ratings. So you'll get a report that shows that, and then for each of the indicators, we've got the top 5. So you can see the forces that came in the top 5 ranking, and obviously some of those there are equals, so there's more than 5, but that shows the best in class. And the idea here is that if your force is doing poorly, so gets a poor score on the overall ranking or on a particular indicator, you can look at what other forces are doing well on that indicator and identify the types of things that they are putting in place that may be having a difference. So there's a chance to really make some improvements. So that's all from me for the time being. I hope that that's been useful. I believe that there is a report that you can look at. So if you want to sort of drill down into more detail, you can do that. And I'm very happy to have a chat about it as well. And of course, we'll be taking questions later.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you very much. Lots to chew on there, and I'm sure you'll want to pick up on several things that Emma said a little bit later on. But meantime, as she indicated, Andy Rhodes, Deputy Chief Constable of the Lancashire Constabulary, will tell us about what Lancashire's doing about this. I presume he represents the good, not the bad, and certainly not the ugly. Come on.
Thanks very much, Gordon. Yeah, this definitely is not a subject that I want to stand up here and talk about as if we've solved it, or that we've eventually found the holy grail of improving well-being in the organisation. What I do want to talk about really here is that the evidence base is growing. Take a look at the top 100 organisations in the world, the places that are the great places to work, where we all want to work, and they are all investing heavily around this subject area. And I'll pick up some of the things that Emma's raised in her survey as I talk through this. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time, therefore, on why we should be doing it. You can either approach this with your head, your heart, or both. If your heart isn't in this, then I'd question what you're doing in a leadership position. And from some of the evidence from your survey, there's clearly people who have achieved senior positions in this organisation, as we have in many, that are lacking the heart around the simple issues around caring for people in the workplace. If those groups of people don't get the heart bit, then get the head bit, do the maths. And I'll talk about some of that and some of the breakdown that we've done in Lancashire, where we can really make a very strong, tough business case for doing this work, which you do need to do because it is tough work. And we are on a journey with it. And what we've been fortunate enough in Lancashire to have access to is one of our inspectors, Ian, who's here today, was already doing some academic study with some of the leading people and practitioners and academics in the field of wellbeing. And we've tapped into that and been very fortunate enough to do it. And I think that's something the service and all of us can actually benefit from, because we were talking on the train on the way down. I've got this thing in my head where I talk about the human fleet, because if I'm just working out on my calculator on the way down here that in our people fleet in Lancashire, the human fleet, we are spending about £500,000 a day. On our vehicle fleet, we're spending about £20 £1,000 a day. And if you compare how you deal with a vehicle in your fleet compared to a human in your fleet, on some of the indicators that spot some of these problems before they become critical in the organisation, nobody's doing the Sunday morning vehicle checks that I used to do as a probationer. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about what wellbeing isn't. So people often think of wellbeing as creaky knees, physiotherapy, a physical aspect. It is that, but it's also a psychological, a financial and a sociological issue. And that's what makes it very complex, and that what makes my wellbeing completely unique to me and your wellbeing completely unique to you. And I don't think we can underestimate that when we're talking about wellbeing, because that's what makes it very, very challenging to do, particularly as a leader, because there is not a one-size-fits-all. It's not training, as I keep telling our head of L&D. You cannot sheep-dip people through how to be great at delivering wellbeing as a first-line manager or a senior leader. Yeah, you've got to develop it over time. I will be talking about a very personal experience I had. I spent 9 years as superintendent, and I'll talk about that because I think if I'm going to stand up here and say this is a personal issue, then it's legitimate to push back at me and say, well, what experience have you had? And I will talk about that. So it's more than the physical, as we can see from that. Things are changing. The pace of change is massive, as we know. I know you talk about that a lot at the conference. The scale, everything. We've reduced in Lancashire in every role, every leadership role is reduced. And some of our chief superintendents overnight are leading double the amount of people that they're used to do. They're managing double the amount of partnerships that they used to manage. They're doing everything in double numbers. And how to deal with that is you've got to therefore change. We're talking about leadership, environment and resilience as our approach. You've got to impact across all those three areas. And for us, one of the huge issues has been our performance culture. Right way down to the front line, talking about how the behaviours that drove that performance culture affected people's well-being, and actually, in a lot of senses, took away meaning from work for our people. Meaning, having meaning in our work and purpose in our work is a massive driver of well-being and a negative driver if you don't have it. So we've got a real command and control culture. If we approach change the way that we deal with a plane that's crashed, which we're great at dealing with, things go badly wrong. It's too fast, it's too quick, and sometimes we sacrifice engagement. But we're operating at 20% less workforce. We're operating with probably just as much to do. So changing the performance culture for us has been a massive opportunity, but also one that we took with our eyes wide open and that we are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. There's also an issue about less HR. If I were to ask for a raise of hands in the audience to who, to their knowledge, knows that throughout their change programmes, HR have taken a hit, how many people would be saying that in their organisations? Yeah? Okay. HR professionals, particularly out in BCUs, in the organisation, supporting frontline leaders, have been hit massively because they're seen as back office, and we all have to save money, don't we? Over time, they have taken on some of the roles and responsibilities of our first-line managers, particularly around some of these tough conversations that I'll talk about in a second. And I know, because we did a review of HR, the glib line at the end of it was, we'll cater for this, mitigate for the risk by sending HR down the line, which is an HR phrase. It's never landed down the line, I have to be honest. It's just another big job, and I noticed 97% tricky HR issues. I'm probably preaching to the converted, and I'll talk about what our approach is to some of those tricky issues. So 4 to 6% of illness is stress, depression or anxiety. We recently attempted to do a bit of a straw poll, because it is an unknown, and the fact it's an unknown is a risk, about how many people in your organisation working under your command or whatever role you've got are on antidepressants prescribed by a GP. If you go to your GP with that 4 to 6% anxiety, stress, depression, your average GP time in this country is 3.5 minutes. That's just about enough time to write you a prescription for antidepressants. Yeah? it is not enough time to ask you what the real problem is. Yeah, and we're dealing with people, we're all 24/7 individuals. So I think head, heart, my proposition is that well-being is probably the greatest risk to our organisation going forward, and it's probably the greatest opportunity. And it's up to ourselves whether we choose to take it or not. There's three aspects here with culture in there. Resilience, environment and leadership. I'm going to quickly talk about each one on their own. Why is this difficult to do? Huge cultural issues. Huge cultural issues. Senior people having to own up that they've got it wrong. Senior people having to own up to the fact that they've run a performance culture that sent people into the ground. And there's got to be, unfortunately now, I'm not going to harbour on about my divorce, but I'm unfortunately now married to a therapist, which I think every police officer should have access to, quite honestly. And she doesn't say very much, but she talks with her eyebrows, which I think is a skill therapists are taught at therapy school. And she's taught, I'm talking about culture to her and the journey we're on. She says, it seems you're addicted to a certain type of culture. And she said in her world, when people are addicted, they have to go through three phases. The first one is to actually acknowledge that there's a problem. The second one is to accept responsibility themselves for that problem. And the third one is to take some action, do something about it. I think the middle block for senior leadership is a crucial one. How many times do you see people saying, well, actually, I'm not rewriting history. I've done 20 years in this organisation. I've behaved like that. I was part and parcel of that. And I'm taking responsibility for it. It's a very powerful thing to do if you've got people who are able to do that at the top of your organisation, because otherwise all this talk looks a little bit inauthentic. It looks like it's okay for you. You've got there, now you're telling us we can't behave like that. Leadership. People often forget there's an emotional connection around leadership. I'm going to show a short animation in a minute so you can have a break from me waffling on and listen to what is, I think, quite an interesting aspect of leadership that not only at an individual level for the leader causes a huge amount of stress and anxiety, but for the people who they work with. I think there's the senior leadership issue around authenticity, much talked about. Very often it's not delivered particularly well. And then there's the leadership throughout the organisation. Everybody's a leader. Role clarity. Are we equipping people to have the conversations we need them to have as early as possible? So I put the snakes in suits up there because if you're in a dysfunctional culture, dysfunctional people will get to the top. You know, when we're talking about snakes in suits, there was an interesting programme on TV about psychopaths recently. And the people who are on there were saying, actually, if you're in a crisis, a psychopath's a pretty good person to be with because they have very little empathy. They get focused on the result. And I was looking at the sort of behaviours associated with psychopaths and reflecting on how many of these people I've actually met along my journey. And I'm sure it's the same in any organisation. I think the thing that we're saying here is there's a behavioural issue around well-being from a leadership perspective, and from a personal perspective, we need to equip people to feel confident to have the conversations that currently are not being had early enough around well-being. And I think the sort of surveys and the evidence base trigger those conversations that people need to have. So I'm going to show you, hopefully this is going to work, a short video. So when people talk about authenticity, one of the things that it is very difficult to get to the bottom of with leaders, and leaders cause a huge amount of issues, either positive or negative around well-being, to find out what it's like to be led by leaders. It's like something that people struggle to get hold of. But I think there are tools out there that can look at what the impact your behaviours have on other people's well-being around you that's well evidenced. And I do pity the poor souls who are coming for our next Superintendent's Board. The first question on their application is, what's it like to be led by you? Which is quite an obvious question, but the second bit is, how do you know? Now, if people, how do you know what it's like to be led by you, is an interesting question, I think, that many of us would find it sometimes quite difficult to answer. Resilience. Often thought about as the bounce back, how to bounce back, how to cope. We have resilience building programs for people so they can cope with our dysfunctional organisations. I think as a senior leader in an organisation, there's a responsibility on you to fix some of the things that mean people have to cope with them. Not just to bring programs in and interventions in that enable people to cope with something that you should be fixing. And again, I'll go back to the performance culture around that. But also, we've asked thousands of our staff what well-being means to them and what it means to their resilience. So again, it's personal, but never assume that you know what that is. Particularly for our frontline staff, what we've found is that yes, there is the first line manager, but a lot of that's driven by the performance culture. It is simple logistics. It's what's my kit like? What's my IT like? What's my vehicle like? It is give us the tools, boss, and we'll do the job, as we all know. And some of those are fixable, and you can tell your staff you've listened and start to fix them. In the more complex cases, it's not as simple as that, but there is a lot of simple, quick win stuff around resilience. And I'll talk a bit in a minute about how people ebb and flow in terms of resilience, how people can be bobbing along feeling pretty good. But Dame Carol Black, who leads nationally for the government on this, will say that well-being is not just the absence of illness. Because you don't see an illness doesn't mean to say you've got great well-being. I did, as I say, 9 years as superintendent. I did 4.5 years in a BCU at Blackpool, working for Mike Cunningham, who is a big supporter of well-being now, which is great because he wasn't back then. And I once remember doing a 360-degree thing for Mike. Well, I don't think he asked me to do it, and he got it, and he said, this can't be right, and this can't be right. All these people who work for you are saying you like this, but I know you like that. They're all wrong, obviously. If everyone who knows Michael knows he's never wrong. And I was acting in a schizophrenic way. And little did Mike know, but I was going through a pretty bad personal crisis. And the reason, as Emma's said, a lot of people spend time at work because they don't want to be at home. And I was doing huge long hours. I was loving every minute of it. But at the same time, I was going pretty rapidly downhill towards a divorce and bankruptcy. And I dug a really depressing photograph out of the... now, that is me 10 years ago. It's a pretty brave picture to put up, that, I think, because unless anyone's going to tell me different, I look a bit better now than I did then. My wife, the new wife, the therapist, another trick there taught is to look into people's eyes. And she said, you've got really, really sad eyes on there. And I was in a really bad state, to be quite honest. And shortly after this photo was taken, I think I came working for Irene, which must have been a challenge. I think at 6'5", ex-support unit officer, people probably thought he can cope with whatever is thrown his way. But when that hit me, I was diagnosed with really bad sleep deprivation. I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't concentrating. And I came to work up at headquarters. So just when you thought things couldn't get worse, you were taken from the best job you've ever had in Blackpool, being a superintendent, to go and work in contact management and corporate development at headquarters, which was just about the final nail in my coffin, I have to say. Did I tell anybody about this? No. Did anybody ask me? Not particularly. I just kept it under the wraps and made some very, very bizarre career decisions in the sort of next 6 months after that, which fortunately I managed to bounce back from, but could have been terminal. So I never went sick either. I haven't got a sick day in my whole career. That doesn't mean to say that I haven't been sick. So one of the things that's interesting around environment, and all as leaders, it's our job to create the environment, is the conversation. Recently, had a load of people in who were sort of aspiring leaders in a room, sergeants and police staff, and said, go back over the last 12 months and give me your emotional highs and lows. And it's an interesting exercise this to do in a group of people. They all work very closely together. 2 things leap out at you. One is that the vast majority of lows and highs are personal, they're not work related. Yeah, so if we think people are coming to work and putting a stab vest on, and they are not carrying with them the baggage that we all carry around with us every day. We're kidding ourselves. The second thing that really strikes you is that these people work very closely together and didn't know about their colleagues' issues that they've had over the last 12 months. If that turns into a performance issue, we've got some really good processes, haven't we, for performance failures. If it turns into a sickness issue, we've got some great processes for people who don't turn up enough, yeah? And then they can descend into crisis. So people aren't talking about these things, is the bottom line. This is a bit of a busy slide. I've thrown it in there because we're basically stratifying the whole organisation in terms of the triangle on the left-hand side. If you just concentrate on the green there, we'll say universal, 75% of our staff are in that. Every now and again, they may bobble out of it into struggling to cope. They might have a bereavement, they might have a traumatic incident at work, they might have relationship problems, but they're fully engaged. They've got line management support, and we've got things like the CPD, which we're thinking of completely re-gearing around the question sets that I know Emma and Affinity have developed through HSE. It's a different conversation at CPD than we're currently having. But that should be good. That's a cultural issue. Line management are all equipped and able to spot the signs if somebody bobbles up into that struggling to cope. Because every misconduct, every H1 sick pension I review, every ET, every grievance, there are missed opportunities where people have accelerated from universal. They've started to struggle with something, yeah? They've started falling out of love with the organisation, yeah? And we haven't intervened, and they've escalated all the way up to crisis, because life's busy, isn't it, out there? And if somebody's off sick and step off the merry-go-round, they're very quickly forgotten sometimes. If they get served discipline forms, they very quickly fall out of love with us, and we fall out of love with them. And there is a huge amount of money, time. Your 97% that you're spending on tricky HR issues are people who are probably in the yellow and the red box. I don't know whether I'm right or wrong with that one. We reckon there's 16% in the struggling to cope, and we're putting interventions in place. We're far from where we want to be with it. Not coping, we reckon we've got about 6% of our workforce. Yeah, not engaged, we're into welfare, performance improvement, professional standards, and they're on plans. When they get into crisis, we're talking about less than 2%, but it's a very expensive 2%. And if you track back how much you're getting out of that person and the damage to them as an individual and the people around them and your diaries, it is a huge amount of money. And recovering people from that top end is nigh on impossible. Yeah, it's just nigh on impossible. And I'm sure, you know, we've all experienced bobbling up and down on that triangle. So I'm going to shut up now. Environment, leadership, resilience, that's the way we approach this. We have got a lot of evidence behind it, and it is very rewarding work, but it's also very challenging work. But one of these things that is hugely worthwhile, I think, in terms of where we're heading over the next 10, 15, 20 years. Thank you.
Thanks, Eddie. We have a few minutes for questions, so anyone's got any comments to make or questions to ask, stick your hands up now. I generally have to kick this off to get things going. Emma, question for you. You may not be able to answer this, but I'm not trying to sound unsympathetic to what you've revealed. It's obviously a problem. Is it any different to any other industry or commercial organisation?
I think if you look across, particularly public services, you get a fairly similar picture, particularly, obviously, health service, education. But it is considerably worse than the norms across the UK population.
Certainly worse than?
The UK norms. So if you look at the workforce in the UK as a whole, the working hours, the level of anxiety and depression are worse.
With the level of bullying, the level of non-cooperation, harsh treatment alleged by management to be the same in other sectors of public service?
I don't have the figures across other public services, so I can't tell you that.
Because that's quite striking,
it would be a guess, yeah.
All right, we had a question. Right, gentleman there, Bob, or the gentleman in front of him, sorry.
From Gwent. If there's a predictable risk to members' health based on reducing numbers and the custom and practice of working hours, etc. Should there be an ACPO-led national strategy to actually address health and welfare support for members and also the wider service?
Andy?
Yes, there should, and that's a proposal that we are trying to take forward with the College of Policing. We have done a lot of engagement with when Mike Cunningham was in charge of Workforce Development Business Area with staff associations, so Unison as well are very, and the Fed are very keen on this. We do need, it's one of the big areas that we have not got an approach for across the service. It's an exciting opportunity, but I have to say I'm not sure that I certainly haven't got the time or the energy to convince everybody who isn't convinced about this that we do need a national plan, but Alex Marshall is very keen on it. Good. Are you happy with that answer, sir? I've got someone else down here. Tell us who you are, sir.
Oh, I'm Jeremy Vaughan from North Wales Police. A question for the DCC. In light of what you're seeking to achieve in Lancashire, how confident are you now that your chief superintendents and superintendents have paid attention to the right things, doing things from the perspective of the public, or is performance management just now got a smile on its face?
Yeah, really good question that, because I think there's a trust issue with our track record around how we manage performance. And when we initially changed how we do performance, there was this lack of trust that say, well, yeah, and when things start getting tough, you'll revert to type. And certainly there was a permafrost, particularly at our senior management team level, we think, where that wasn't getting through to the front line, either because we hadn't convinced them enough or we hadn't persuaded them enough. And one of the things that I think we did benefit from was we had an engagement tool which was like an outpouring across the organisation around the performance culture and some of the behaviours, and also actually saying it's not even working, you know. So it's not as if you're giving up something that you're going to miss. Some of this stuff isn't making any difference. And I think that's accelerated where we are now, you know. But my chief's the head of the performance business area. He's seen some increase in crime, and he's held his nerve completely. So I think we've had that bit where we've wobbled and hopefully got through it. And Emma, I mean, I keep sounding like Mr. Tough Guy, you know, but it's a valid question, I think. You know, did you ask people about their expectations of their work levels and the crises they might face? Because obviously anyone entering the police service or any service like that must know that it's not like any other job where you can put something in a file at the end of the day and shove it in the drawer and forget it, because you're dealing with crises that have to be resolved there and then, and that means you've got to work longer, you're under greater stress. Did you get any research on that?
I think the big research finding around this is that piece around you can handle high demands provided you have the resources and you have the control and the autonomy. It's when we start getting that imbalance that it's the problem. And I agree, you know, that it is, of course, that kind of a job, that kind of career where there are going to be high demands. They're not going to be predictable necessarily. But that doesn't need to lead to poor well-being if the other issue, you know, if the autonomy and the support is in place. And if it's not, you know, persistent over time. I think it's where you know, we can all handle ups and downs. We just can't handle a permanent up.
And the most disturbing thing from the surveys of all these resilience surveys over the years is that it stayed at more or less the same level and arguably slightly worse. Which brings me to the next point I was going to put to you, Andy. You know, 26% cuts in the police service so far. Prospect of more cuts coming. 25% of superintendents lost in the last 3 years. You know, what are the prospects for the future with regard to stress and anxiety for the people sitting out there and the people they represent?
Okay, I mean, one of the things that we've found is, consistent with what Emma said, is that actually we create a lot of work ourselves, particularly senior officers. It has a cause and effect, and it has a real stress effect on people as well, things like how you run your performance regime. So we've got to stop that, because that is taking stress, work and pressure off people, and deal with it differently. And the second thing is, I mean, we use systems thinking in Lancashire. It's not everyone wants to do that, but we are reorganising how work gets done. And we are turning the tap off on certain types of demand that we say are lower risk to other types of demand, therefore allowing people to focus on what matters more, and victim impact, etc.
Dave down here. I mean, it's a beacon of enlightenment, but I'm just wondering what your experiences in other forces. Dave, it is Dave, isn't it?
It's on.
Alan, sorry, my apologies.
Alan Lees from West Yorkshire. Some forces are looking to remove the rank of Chief Superintendent. What do you see the role of the Chief Superintendent in the future?
Well, yeah, I have to be careful what I say here, because some forces have removed Chief Inspectors as well. And I know the debate's raging hot here around how many forces we have. When I look around at who's taking out superintendents, I look at how big the force is, and we've got some chief superintendents running forces, running a BCU that's bigger than a force that's got a whole ACPO team over it. So I think there's a debate about how much management you need per se. Chief superintendents for us are a key part of having a BCU, and a key part of our ethos in Lancashire has always been to have local connections, local communities and ownership at a BCU level. We've currently gone about as big as we could possibly go, I have to say. In East Lancashire, for example, and I've got one of my chief superintendents here, you know, they've got 1,000 staff and all the complexities that go with that. We don't want to lose that, but we've stayed with the BCU model, and we think, you know, chief superintendents have got a huge leadership role as far as we're concerned moving forward.
I think that's your question on. Thank you. Someone at the back, identify yourself. Thank you. Tell us who you are.
My name is Patrick Cairns. I'm the CEO of the Police Treatment Centre, one of your supported charities for this evening. We see about 4,000 officers who come through our charity every single year for physical and psychological issues, and we try and help them get better, both while they're with us and afterwards. And I think about 20% of those are now presenting for psychological issues. And it's really an observation, because although more and more of them are declaring their hand when they arrive, and they'll chat in the corridors, they'll chat in the sessions and say, actually, I've got a mental health problem here, or I've got a stress problem here, there's actually quite a significant majority of them who present for a bad shoulder, and actually when they're in with the nurse on the first day, they'll say, actually, I've come here for a bad shoulder, and I do have a bad shoulder, but really I've got to the point where I do need some help, and I've got a stress issue, a mental health issue, or a psychological issue. So, Andy, I'd like to really applaud you for standing up and being counted and declaring that you had an issue, and it's one that you did work through. And what we're trying to do at the Police Treatment Centre in our charity is present it as a strength rather than a weakness, in that you've got to a certain point and weaker people would probably have fallen by the wayside much earlier on, but you're a strong man or a strong woman to get to this point, and we all have our reserves of courage or how we're dealing with stress. But when you reach those reserves, it's actually a sign of strength to put your hand up and say, listen, I'm now into the reserve, I've gone past the point where I can deal with this myself, and I do need help from other people. So we're seeing more and more of it. So Andy, well done for declaring your hand, and I think we need more leaders in this forum and in the wider policing community to stand up and say, listen, I've been there, I know what it's like, I have survived, but you do need to ask for help to allow us to support you.
Thank you very much. Also, that experience, albeit anecdotal, suggests that the official figures, the surveys you do with good intent, you know, about who's suffering from stress, who's suffering from anxiety, may be slightly misleading, maybe understating the case, because if people are disguising it, hiding it until they get to see the nurse about the shoulder, it's a bigger problem than we think, yeah?
I think there is that risk. I mean, I hope, because it's an anonymous survey, that people can be more honest about it. And we don't ask, are you depressed, are you anxious? We ask a series of questions that is a validated questionnaire that taps into that. But I'd agree with that last statement. I think it takes a lot of courage to actually put your hand up and admit, and I think that having that degree of vulnerability actually stands you in good stead in the future, and it does mean that you can draw on the support you need and makes you a stronger person.
Is it also, any more questions, by the way, stick your hand up because we're coming to the end. Is this, the whole of this, to some extent, an indication or a reflection of what we were talking about yesterday, really, when we're talking about coming out of the closet? Is it a reflection of the fact there is still within the police service, and particularly male members of the police service, this sort of macho image, this sort of macho, I'm fine, you know, don't worry about me, sort of sense at the back of their heads, and the feeling that if they do, they'll be laughed at or scorned upon by their colleagues and indeed their bosses? Yeah,
I mean, I think there's, you know, we deal with a lot of traumatic situations, and part and parcel of that journey, everybody in the senior leadership position started somewhere on the street dealing with these things. I think how people deal with that is different, and I think previously people have maybe had an even harder culture than we've got now. We've all gone to the pub afterwards, got drunk and felt all right for a couple of days. But the US Army, the US military are pushing this massively. And they are pushing this, and they'll say their cultural issue is exactly that. You don't ask for support and nobody offers it you. And that's the cultural issue. And I think that, in essence, is, you know, we're training up people now to have these conversations, and the first thing they're saying, and these are volunteers who are personally very well equipped already. They've got high empathy, all that type of thing, and they're saying, what do I do if they say this to me? Well, you know, we've got to give them some support for somewhere that to go, but also the confidence that they can have that conversation. You know, it's just life, basically.
OK, I'm going to hand over to Tim. I'm sure you'd like to show your appreciation for the panel. Thank you.